Hello, my name is Görkem Güngör. Today I will present the IPCC 6 Assessment Report chapters on regional and sectoral greenhouse gas emission trends. The first section, the regional contributions, the regional trends. Since the fifth assessment report, the developed countries in North America, Europe, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand as a group have not managed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions substantially. However, in the Asia and Pacific, including Eastern Asia, China, Southern Asia, India, and Southeast Asia and Pacific, these countries have rapidly increased their share of global greenhouse gas emissions. And when we compare the last decade with the previous decade, the average annual greenhouse gas emission growth across all regions slowed in the last decade compared to the previous decade, but with the exception of Eastern Europe and West Central Asia. And historically, since 1990s, the world has been grouped in 10 distinct groups, depending on the geography and also the socio-economic development trends. The names have changed somewhat, but still we have 10 regions, and when we aggregate these 10 regions, we can represent the world data. And in the figure from the section, it is evident that Eastern Asia is dominant in the increase in greenhouse gas emissions. The average annual greenhouse gas emissions change. For developed countries, there is a reduction, but in general, for the developing countries, there is an increase. But this trend has not reversed for net zero target achievement. I explored the data using the sequential Las Vegas decomposition for the regional trends. For this, I used the 6 assessment report database hosted by EASA, and the decomposition of the carbon dioxide equivalent emissions for the regions includes the population effect, the regional population per total population, the share of population, the GDP per capita, representing the productivity, and carbon dioxide emissions per GDP, representing the the emission intensity. When we look at the trends, it is apparent that for the emission intensity, there's in general a negative trend, the decreasing trend when we look at the regional decomposition. However, when we look at the GDP per capita, especially for Eastern Asia and Southern Asia, there is an increase, but in general, for all regions, there is an increase. For Africa, there is a structural shift from Eastern Asia to Africa regarding the share of population and the effect on the emissions. And finally, for the general population, there is an effect on Eastern Asia, significant increase, but in general, for most of the regions, there's an increasing population effect. There is also international trade data. I first used population weighted for distributing the international trade data. And following that, I did this for the GDP. There is not any significant difference in both when I distribute the trade data. And this is the citation for the 6 assessment report database. Looking at the sectoral contributions, the average greenhouse gas emissions growth has been fastest, especially in the transport sector related to the international trade. And this is followed by direct emissions in the industry sector and the energy sector. In the previous decade, as reported in the 5th assessment report, the fastest greenhouse gas emissions growth was observed for industry, followed by energy sector. And in the 6th assessment report, we have the highest growth in the transport sector. And to elaborate this, I did a sectoral decomposition for the Eastern Asia region. The I means the sector here. The carbon dioxide, this is not equivalent, this is only carbon dioxide emissions. And the decomposition is for final energy, the share of final energy in the sectors, and the carbon dioxide emission intensity. There is a difference in the sectors. In the report, there is also an energy sector. But when we look at the sixth assessment report database for the demand sectors, these are agriculture, forestry and fisheries, industry, residential and commercial, and transportation. We don't have the energy sector as a demand sector. The energy is distributed to all the demand sectors. But when we look at the decomposition data, there is a significant contribution from the energy demand in the industry. There is a structural shift from agriculture, forestry and fisheries, industry, residential and commercial to the transportation sector. And this is discussed as the important contribution of international trade, especially sea freight and air transport. For the energy intensity, we have a significant reduction effect from the industry, somewhat from residential and commercial sector and transport sector. But in general, the increasing energy demand in Eastern Asia contributes positively to the carbon dioxide emissions. The latest developments, this is an article published in the Nature Climate Action. This article argues that most of the emission scenarios have converged to the SSP2, the middle of the road pathway. There has been some challenges in the scenario usage. Initially, there were combined scenarios combining the shared socioeconomic pathways and the reference concentration pathways. But as the academia dominantly uses energy models, the SSPs, the shared socioeconomic pathways, are used also as climate scenarios, which is actually misleading. And there's a dominant trend to use the SSP2 middle of the road pathway. However, the authors critique that the existing scenarios are mostly at the lowest quantile. Therefore, the SSP2 scenario might be missing this general trend of population development, which is one of the main drivers for a regional contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. As one solution, weighting probabilistic projections on SSPs is recommended by the authors. There are challenges from the aggregation of data to global and downscaling to regional. And as the climate hotspots are the small island developing states, least developed countries, and landlocked developed countries, these countries are somewhat curtained behind all these aggregated data, but they should come to the forefront in the further climate reports. And in conclusion, there are demographic uncertainties which have a major effect on the scenario development. The current IPCC synthesis processes might be underestimating the demographic uncertainties. There is a convergence to the middle of the road pathway, but actual population scenarios are trending toward the lowest quantile. There are significant challenges from aggregation of global data, and this aggregation, upscaling and downscaling, this has significant effect on not seeing the small island developing states, least developed countries, and landlocked developing countries as a focus in the assessment reports of the IPCC. and these countries should shift forward so that they are much better represented. I thank you very much for your kind attention.